All right, so today we're gonna dive into something that I think a lot of our listeners probably deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And that is living alone, living that solo life, and really finding ways to not just survive,
Right.
but really thrive in that space.
Exactly.
So we're looking at material today from the LPot Community,
Okay.
a discussion they had titled "Living Alone, Thriving and Surviving."
I like that.
I thought that was a really good title.
Yeah. Puts a nice positive spin on it.
It does, and that's kind of what we want to get at in this deep dive is, there are some very specific considerations for folks who really value their independence and choose to live this way. And we want to kind of pull those out and really give you guys something to think about.
Totally. And it's interesting how often the conversation around living alone kind of focuses on the surviving part, just getting by, making sure you don't, become a hermit or whatever. But I think, this LPot discussion really highlights the thriving aspect of it.
Yeah.
That this is often a deliberate choice that people make to be on their own. And really, how do we make that the best possible experience?
Yeah, I love that.
Okay,
so I want to jump right into something that I think is really fundamental, and that is your mental and emotional well-being.
Okay.
Right? Because the community brought up a really important point.
Yeah.
And that is that, too much alone time, well, it can be great, and it can be what we crave and we want. Sometimes it can actually create space for some negative thought patterns.
Totally.
To really kind of take root.
It's like if you're alone with your thoughts for too long, sometimes those thoughts can go to some pretty dark places.
And they can spiral, right?
Exactly.
Have you ever experienced that?
I mean, I think everybody has to some extent,
Yeah.
Especially people who live alone. And I think what's crucial is what this discussion brings up is like having proactive strategies to deal with that.
Yes.
So, instead of just sort of acknowledging like, oh, I'm in a bit of a down mood today.
Right.
They talk about things like journaling, potentially journaling about gratitude, what are you grateful for? Or even journaling about identifying triggers.
Right.
What are the things that tend to set off those negative thought spirals for you?
Totally.
And then, even taking a few minutes every day for mindful meditation can really kind of create a buffer against just constant rumination.
Yeah, I love that idea of a buffer because you're right. It's so easy to get stuck in those negative thought loops and just not even realize it's happening.
And not have anybody to kind of pull you out of it or snap you out of it.
Exactly. And the community also talks about like recognizing when those internal resources aren't enough.
Yeah.
Right. And not being afraid to seek therapy and viewing that not as a last resort, but as a proactive tool for really maintaining mental clarity.
I think that's such a healthy way to look at it.
Absolutely.
Like it's not a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
It's a sign of strength that you're taking care of yourself.
Taking care of yourself. So we talked about the inner world.
Yeah.
What about the outer world? Like our physical health.
Okay.
Right. The LPot community also touches on the idea that, when you live alone.
Yeah.
It can be easy to let those healthy habits kind of slide.
Absolutely.
Because you're only answering to yourself.
Right. No one's there to be like, hey, did you go to the gym today?
Exactly. Did you eat your vegetables?
Yeah, exactly.
What did you have for dinner last night?
Yeah.
So did you find that...
Well, the discussion really emphasizes the importance of routine, I think, which makes a lot of sense. When you think about it, if you live with other people, there are these kind of inherent social cues for things like meal times. You tend to eat dinner together or, you might go for a walk together after dinner or something.
Sure.
But when you're on your own, you don't have those external cues. So it's really about building that structure internally. So they talk about, scheduling your workouts, just like any other important appointment.
Absolutely.
Put it in your calendar. Setting aside specific times for meal prepping.
Yes.
Having healthy ingredients on hand.
Totally.
So you're not tempted to just order takeout every night.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a really good point. Like, we don't often think about those things, but those are like the biggest stumbling blocks.
Oh, totally.
When you're living by yourself.
And then also, they talk about sleep.
Oh, yeah.
Consistent sleep patterns, which are also so foundational to everything else.
To everything else.
And again, if you live with other people, there might be like a shared bedtime routine or something. But when you're on your own, it can be really easy to let that slide.
Yeah, I've definitely been there.
Yeah.
Where you're like, oh, I'll just stay up and watch one more episode.
One more episode.
Whatever it is, and then all of a sudden you're not getting enough sleep.
Exactly.
Okay, so this next area is something that I think you might not immediately think about when it comes to living alone.
Yeah.
But that is your social skills.
Right.
Like the potential for your social skills to kind of get a little dusty when you're mostly interacting with yourself.
Right.
The discussion on LPot mentioned that some folks reported feeling a little awkward or a little less confident in social situations after a long time of being on their own.
Totally. It makes sense.
Have you ever experienced that?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, it's not like I become completely incapable of socializing, but it's more like the ease and the natural flow becomes a little rusty.
Yes.
A little less automatic.
Less automatic.
Yeah.
Okay, so what can we do about that?
Well, I think that the community's suggestion of, kind of like regular small interactions is really key.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be anything major.
Yeah.
It could be as simple as like striking up a conversation with your barista or chatting with a neighbor or, even engaging in online communities around your interests.
Right.
But those kind of like low stakes interactions can really help to just keep those social muscles gently active.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Just keeping those social muscles gently active.
Yeah, so that when you do want to have a more substantial interaction, you're not starting from scratch.
Exactly.
You've been kind of, flexing those muscles a little bit.
Yeah, there's a really interesting nuance that I think is worth unpacking.
Okay.
And that has to do with our relationship to solitude itself.
Okay.
So the LPot discussion brought up the idea of loving your own company so much that it almost becomes like a barrier.
Interesting.
To connecting with others.
Okay.
And it can lead to almost like an all or nothing mentality.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like you're either completely alone or you're completely with people.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think that that's where the distinction between healthy solitude and potential isolation becomes really critical.
Yes.
Like enjoying your own company is fantastic. It's a source of strength. It's a sign of, self-awareness and all those good things.
Absolutely.
But if that enjoyment kind of hardens into an avoidance of all social contact, then it can become limiting. It's about maintaining that balance.
Right.
So valuing your alone time, but also remaining open to connecting with others when and how you choose.
Yeah. It's not an all or nothing thing.
It's not an all or nothing thing.
It's a spectrum, right?
Exactly. It's about agency. It's about, conscious choice.
Having that choice.
So rather than sort of, just rigidly adhering to solitude as like the only desirable state.
Okay, I love that. And finally, let's talk about something that underpins a lot of this independence, and that is financial stability.
Yes.
So the LPot community acknowledged that for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Who really value their independence. Managing their own finances is a key part of that.
Makes sense.
But it can also come with its own challenges.
Absolutely.
Right.
Because when you're the only one responsible for bringing in the income and managing the expenses, consistent income and careful planning become even more vital.
So what are some key takeaways there?
Well, the discussion really points to the importance of budgeting.
Yeah.
Like really understanding your income and your expenses.
Yeah.
Exploring potential avenues for passive income, whether that's renting out a spare room or starting a side hustle or whatever.
Yeah.
To provide an extra layer of security.
Right.
And then crucially, having a financial safety net.
Yeah.
For unexpected events.
That emergency fund.
Exactly. Because when you're on your own, you don't have that kind of like built-in support system that you might have if you were living with a partner or family or whatever.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the LPot community's insights on thriving while living alone, we've really looked at 5 key interconnected areas. Your mental health, your physical well-being, maintaining your social skills, that relationship to solitude itself.
Very interesting.
And financial stability.
Totally. And I think it's all about balance.
It is all about balance.
And it's all about being proactive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So with all of this in mind, I want to leave our listeners with something to really chew on. Considering these different facets of independent living, what is one small, concrete adjustment that you could make in your own life right now that you think would have the biggest positive impact?
That's a good question.
It's a question worth exploring.
Yeah, it is.
And with that, we'll wrap up today's deep dive.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.